All right, so we're going to think about now participating, communities participating, and this is where we come in. How do we facilitate this in this process of identifying and listing, grouping, inventorying heritage, intangible heritage? So again, this idea of itemizing heritage, we're separating, again, source communities, groups, and individuals, the values, the significance they hold and attribute to their expressions. And also, I must mention the places in which these expressions evolve. So we're adding values again, we're decontextualizing intangible cultural heritage. And the way I like to look at it is, again, we're diluting source meanings and values and local values, the nuances, the specificity, with more general values and meanings, this idea of humanity and universality. So we're kind of moving away from what really gave these expressions their life. So that loss of specificity, uniqueness. So looking at the yang weaving, it's at the local level, it's specific. There's so many other things that this community do that produces or that perhaps they feel senses of belonging about or pride, not just sitting at the loom and not just selling the products or showing them off or getting recognition for them. There are other aspects to this expression that brings them together to keep doing it. And then let's pretend it gets recognized at a national level, so it's a national tradition. Think about all those new values that's added to that. So people in Bangkok, not saying there aren't any people in Bangkok who find it important, but just it becomes this national tradition. That's interesting. And then what if it made it to the representative list of all of humanity? So I'm sitting in New York and yang weaving is so important to me, right? Does it work that way? I mean, it is, of course, but that's on a personal level. So again, this yang weaving tradition, this expression, can only represent itself. Think about it, it's so simple. How can it represent any other weaving tradition? In Ireland or in America or in South America? It can only represent itself. It can't even represent weaving traditions in general. So really, how do we maintain and inject, that specificity, locality, uniqueness? How does it get transferred onto a list? Right? How do we represent all those nuanced meanings? And this is an image of folk musicians, young folk musicians, playing outside a museum in a town 20 minutes north of the city of Newcastle called Morpeth. And that's the Duchess of Northumberland. But yes, she was visiting the Bagpipe Museum. It was his 21st birthday, and they were performing for her. All right, so I was thinking about this idea with the rapper dance, right? We're all familiar a little bit with this dance that I looked at in my research. So I pretended, just quickly, what would a file be in the inventory or on the database, or what would the page be on the website for the rapper dance? Well, just briefly, location, Northeast England. Practitioners, what do we put? Tom, Jenny, Kate, Ruth, Chris, Pip, Sam? Oh, do we get that specific? Right? And then who are they? And then what's the significance? What do we write? And who are we, of course? But what do we write? Tom says, I love the dance because it makes me feel I'm part of a team. Do we write that Marianne says it's important because I remember learning it when I was 16? Where do we include all that information? If you believe that information is important and must remain with the expression. So that's that idea of disconnecting and separating and decontextualizing. Where does these meanings, the vitality of intangible heritage go? And what we really need to think about, since identification, inventorying is the first step, right? Nations, they sign on to the convention. It's the first thing they must do. From the very start, we're risking this itemization, of intangible heritage from the very start. So what we're doing, we're promoting a non-holistic view of intangible heritage from the very beginning, before we even look at safeguarding practices. We're isolating intangible cultural heritage. Again, we're separating from the social, political, cultural, environmental, just to name a few, contexts in which it has evolved and from which it gets its life. And so I'll give an example from the rapper dance again. It's just a wonderful tradition. Since the 1970s, women have been performing it. Now this tradition goes back to, they believe, since it was always passed on orally, the late 18th century, late 1700s. And it grew out of the coal mining region of the Northeast. If any of you are familiar with that part of England, coal mining was one of the biggest industries, along with lead mining and shipbuilding. And coal miners were predominantly men, and so this was a male tradition. And yet, in the 1970s, there are women that are performing it. completely accepted by the rapper dancing community, network of performers. And so there, right on that level, right on that note, you see that there's this community-based decision-making. They allow that for women to dance. This is a change in the tradition. And I just want to point out there are associations of folk dance in England that will not allow the rapper dancing community to become a part of this association because they think it's inauthentic since women are now dancing it. And the rapper dancers do not care. And I love that. They're deciding what's authentic and what isn't. So this is from the bottom up, really. They are safeguarding their own heritage and allowing for change. But what I really want to point out here is that that idea of female participation, particularly in the 1970s, reflects larger social changes. So the increase in gender equality that's happening in society proper, larger context of society, is infiltrating and affecting an intangible cultural expression. And that change is part of its vitality. You know, we need to keep intangible cultural heritage in these contexts so that it can respond and change to environmental and political forces, for example. And so just a silly basic diagram on this idea of the holistic viewpoint of intangible cultural heritage. I just thought of some general contexts that affect the rapper dancers because they embody the heritage. Of course, these circles could be on top of each other. I just was letting you see how they intertwine, and this is intangible cultural heritage. It's these interconnections between, in general, place, people, and their heritage. So how do we promote this in an inventorying exercise? Again, how do we give that holistic viewpoint if we're listing? What do we list here? So let's look at community involvement, only because maybe this is one way to invigorate the process with that locality, the specificity, the vitality of intangible heritage. So we're going to go and look at some of the readings. In 2006, there was an expert meeting on community involvement in safeguarding ICH. This was hosted and organized by UNESCO ACCU, the Asia Pacific Cultural Center. In there, the report from this expert meeting, section 3.2, involvement of communities in inventorying their ICH. I thought it was interesting that those who participated in this meeting believe that in order to inventory this type of heritage, we must exclude exclusive top-down approaches. That's a quote. So that's interesting. That from this meeting, this idea of noting that there is a top-down approach and that we need to try to guard against it in a way. And this, of course, is because national governments retained the most control when drafting the convention in this whole safeguarding movement. And that report also notes that in order to involve communities, you first have to identify these communities, groups, and representatives of these groups, perhaps individuals as well. You inventory only intangible heritage that is recognized by communities and groups. Permission is granted by the practitioners of these expressions. And when involving non-community members, you also seek consent of the community. That's interesting as well. You respect access issues to ICH, again, privacy, secrecy, again, this comes up. And you gain consent from the communities if you want to nominate the file, as they call it, the expression for international lists. So this, according to that workshop meeting, this is one way we can look at how to involve communities. They also noted we must negotiate between all stakeholders, not just a couple groups of stakeholders are negotiating. But I'd like you to keep in mind that UNESCO can't really reach the local level. It must go through the national governments. That's how the structure is set up. That's how the framework is set up. So how does UNESCO talk to that local level? And does the local level want to talk to UNESCO? We don't know. How do you must involve local regional administration. Perhaps this is a way forward to promote this bottom-up approach. We can think of Japan and how they do it, as Peter noted. Do we create code of ethics so that we can reduce possible conflicts? We all agree on ways to meet and convene and deal with each other. Perhaps advisory bodies, support teams, that consist of perhaps community members, NGO representatives, researchers, the public. Perhaps they can help support this inventorying system in order to involve local communities. So this came out of that 2006 expert meeting.